Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 500 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand, with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am so honored to have award-winning journalist and author Clara Bingham here to talk with us about her newest book, The Movement: How Women's Liberation Transformed America, 1963 to 1973. Hi, Clara.
Hi, Brandon. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to have access to all of your amazing members.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. Everybody is very excited to get started. Before we do, let me give you all that standard information that keeps everything running smoothly. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but you can also continue to submit questions during the entirety of the talk by clicking that questions button that's below the live stream video. If you're already in full screen mode, then you'll probably need to hit that escape key to minimize, or you won't see those 3 tabs underneath the video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry if you have to leave early for any reason whatsoever. Everybody will be emailed a registration link, or a recording link, in about 24 hours. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Clara Bingham is an award-winning journalist and the author of The Movement, Witness to the Revolution, Women on the Hill, and the co-writer of Class Action, which became the movie North Country, starring Frances McDormand and Charlize Theron. A former Washington, D.C. correspondent for Newsweek, her writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, The Guardian, and The Daily Beast, among others. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. Again, welcome. We are so happy to have you here today. How are you doing today? What's the weather like?
Good. I'm here in Brooklyn on the first day of spring, where it's about 40 degrees and raining, but we're hoping that the skies will clear pretty soon.
Yeah, I hope they do too. So I do want to just kind of start off giving our listeners a quick overview of the movement and what that is, just to kind of set the stage for the conversation ahead. Can you do that for us, please?
Sure. The movement, it's actually the first oral history of the second wave feminist movement. The first wave was suffrage back in the late 1800s. The second wave, which was born between the years that I write in this book, 63 to 73, during that 10-year period, is incredibly significant because it's the first time in recorded human history that women demanded freedom and were able to raise their status from second-class citizen to almost equal citizens. Women had been trying for centuries to do that, and it had never worked. Women won the vote in 1920, but had very few rights besides the vote. So this was a monumental revolution that had a huge impact on 50% of our country's population. And it was both a boardroom, a factory floor, and a bedroom revolution. It affected every part of people's lives. So I was born in 1963, so I missed this. I was one of the first early generations to benefit from all of the doors that this amazing generation opened for me, and of course all of the thousands and millions of women who came later. So I wanted to get to these women before it was too late, before their stories were lost to history. So I set out to interview over 100. I interviewed about 120 women between the ages of 75 and 95, and then spliced their stories all together in a narrative arc that stretches from 63, about when it starts with Betty Friedan's publication of the feminine Mystique, and goes all the way to 1973 with the Supreme Court Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion nationally.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned that you interviewed 120 women, and Marguerite's question is how did you select those interviewees But I also want to mention that in the back of the book, you have that lovely section where you have your list of people that you interviewed. And you mentioned that not everyone's story is cited in the book, but you give them credit. You give them all credit for shaping your understanding of the history during that time. So how did you select those interviewees, and how did you decide what interviews went in and which ones didn't?
Well, that was a long reporting process. The whole project, soup to nuts, took me about 5 years. And so I spent a lot of time trying to find women who I only wanted to talk to, and I also interviewed men, to people who were in the room, who were on the streets, who were making change themselves. So I didn't interview a lot of historians or pundits. I just wanted people who were there. And the reason for that is there's a real immediacy to hearing their stories about what it was like to be on the front lines of massive social change. And it also made it more personal because at the time, the personal is political, which was the very important slogan of the women's liberation movement. And so by finding people who were willing to tell me their personal stories, that was very exciting. So it was a long process. I made a chronology. I figured out which events I wanted to focus on, who were the characters who were involved in those events. And then I set about trying to find them. The first woman I interviewed was Susan Brown Miller. She was a friend of mine. And so I thought, okay, you got to start somewhere. Why not with one of the great chroniclers of this era? And she wrote for the Village Voice and the New York Times at the time, and was everywhere in New York when so much change was going on. She covered lots of protests and group meetings and speak outs. And so she, like many of the women I interviewed, was in her late 70s, early 80s, and was looking back at her life. She had a 50-year span to, analyze, wow, we really did make a difference. And so she helped lead the way for me. I asked her for 5 names. And then the next person I talked to, I asked for 5 names. And it went from there. Sometimes I'd dig people up on Facebook. It was a whole gumshoe, exciting process. I just loved the adventure of finding these women. One of my favorite stories, and I'm not going to bore you with all my stories this early on, but was tracking down Frances Beale, who famously wrote Double Jeopardy. This manifesto came out in 1969 called Double Jeopardy: To Be Black and Female. And I credit this with one of the first examples of intersectionality. And she's Black. She worked in civil rights organization in New York at the time, but I just couldn't find her. And I knew she was in her 80s and that she'd moved to California and was living in Oakland. So when I went out to Oakland and started interviewing people there, I asked them all, do you know Frances Beale? Do you know? The last person I got to just before my flight took off said, he picked up her phone, called her, and sent me to Frances's new retirement home in Oakland. And there she was with all of her marbles and not very mobile, which meant she was the perfect person to interview. She couldn't get away from me. So there were lots of trials and errors and adventures. And one of the things I meant to say at the very beginning is I got, because I'm not this generation, I had no idea how bad it was for them and how much they changed until I dug into the numbers. And in the 1960s, just to give you a sense to set the scene for what it was, what this revolution was up against. 1 out of every 3 people who graduated from college were women. 60% of women who were in college dropped out so they could get married. The average age of marriage was 20 in the 1960s. There were 3% of all doctors were women. And about 5% of all lawyers were women. Less than 1% of judges were women. Women had very few employment opportunities outside of the home. You could be a domestic, you could be a nurse, you could be a teacher, a secretary, or a flight attendant. And that was one of the hardest jobs to get, and one of the more glamorous ones, but you were fired automatically at age 32. Aged out, 32. Too old, then you were an old maid. You also were instantly fired if you got engaged, or God forbid, if you got pregnant. And that was about it. Also, there was a lot of public space segregation against women. That had all ended for racial segregation. It ended with the end of Jim Crow when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. But still into the 60s and 70s, there were many male-only bars and restaurants. And there was even a male-only flight that United flew from Chicago to New York multiple times a day called the Executive. And from 1950 until 1973, only men could fly on those flights. And so if you were a female executive, you couldn't get a ticket. And that was completely legal. Women also had no political power. In 1970, as late as 1970, there were 10 women in Congress, U.S. Congress, out of 435 members of Congress. Now there are 151, just to give you a sense. We're now at 28%. Which still isn't good enough. But back in 1970, there were 0 governors. So women weren't in state legislatures. They weren't in the judiciary. Many states didn't require women to serve on juries or even encourage them to serve on juries. That wasn't made a national legal requirement until 1975 for women to serve on juries. There are lots of bizarre laws out there. For example, in Michigan and California, women couldn't be bartenders unless their husbands owned the bar or their father. And until 1974, women couldn't get credit cards, a mortgage, unless they had a man, usually their husband or their father, sign for them, regardless of their education or job level or income level. So all of this was completely legal until the amazing revolution of the second wave.
And is it fair to say that second wave of feminism kind of kicked off with that seed of a word, sex, being added to the Equal Rights Act?
I was hoping you would ask me that. Yes. In 1964, when the Civil Rights Act, the sweeping, amazing bill signed by LBJ, passed, it ended Jim Crow. It ended racial segregation in the South and in many parts of the country. And it had many sections to it. One was Title VII, which was just about employment. And Title VII said that no employer could discriminate on the basis of race, colored, creed, or national origin. But you could definitely discriminate against women. Then at the very end, the bill had already been through committee. It had been debated for a long time. But near the end, when it was on the floor of the House, a unlikely congressman from Virginia named Howard Smith, who was very powerful. He was chairman of the Rules Committee, added the word sex to that list of who you could not discriminate against in employment. His objective was to scuttle the Civil Rights Bill. He was a segregationist, racist. He did not want this bill to pass. But there was an underground group of feminist legal activists on the Hill who knew that he had a lot of power. And they, of course, wanted to have the entire Civil Rights Bill, address gender equality, knew that was politically impossible. So they encouraged Howard Smith to add sex to Title VII. And he did. And the bill passed with sex in it, and he, of course, voted against it. But this was the first legal advancement for women since they won the vote in 1920. So it was the beginning of what would become a very important legal, precedent-setting moment where women started to push the laws in order to gain equality, and they could hang their hat on this first one. And after this bill was passed, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was established in 1965, and a third of the complaints that came into that commission were from women. Many of them flight attendants who were very early out of the box trying to fight the really oppressive patriarchal, system that they were part of.
Mm-hmm. And most of us know some of those, bigger figures to come out of the second wave of feminism, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, famously defending a man on the basis of sex, Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan. But what you did was give voice to those who inspired those women that I just mentioned, those names that we give so much credit to, and we should, don't get me wrong. And Gracie from Rosenberg Library is saying, hi, I haven't read the book just yet, but I was wondering if all of the American women were covered in the book, meaning gender, ethnicity, social, economic status, religion, and region. And that is something that you pay particular attention to in the book, right?
Yes. Gracie's fine that you haven't read it, but I hope you will. And then you will see that I tried very hard to achieve what you just listed, and I didn't. I was not able to get everybody. There are plenty of holes in this story that I admit in the introduction, because otherwise I would need 4 volumes. I just couldn't fit it all in. But I tried my best, and I made a very high priority over finding women of color who were instrumental in pushing this movement forward. In fact, I really consider some of these key women of color as the progenitors of the second wave. And I'll give you an example of that. Pauli Murray was one of those women in the underground on Capitol Hill who encouraged Congressman Howard Smith to add sex to Title VII. She was a Black legal scholar from North Carolina. She was a civil rights advocate and activist. She went to Howard University Law School in 1944, one of only 2 women in her class. The second one dropped out almost immediately because they faced so much sexism from their professors and their fellow students. Regardless of that, Pauli Murray graduated first in her class. She was really a legal genius, I thought. She went on to Yale Law School to get her PhD. But meanwhile, she started developing feminist legal jurisprudence. And she wrote an important law review article called Jane Crow, Women in the Law in Title VII, in which she outlined what all of the different laws in America that discriminated against women. And she said that she understood racism, of course, when she walked into Howard Law School. But when she got out of Howard Law School, her consciousness was raised as a feminist, because she understood that sexism was just as powerfully debilitating to people's rights and to her rights personally as racism. And so she was the person who gave Betty Friedan the idea of starting the National Organization for Women, because she knew women needed an NAACP, which she had, of course, been on the board of and had been involved in. But she came up with this idea, and she and Betty Friedan, together with a group of other women, started the National Organization for Women in 1966. So this was still early on in the story, but I also write about other really important women of color who were involved in this, who were leaders in this movement, like Eleanor Holmes Norton, Fannie Lou Hamer, Florence Kennedy, Barbara Smith, Margaret Sloan, and Shirley Chisholm, who, of course, famously ran for president in 1962. And her story is in this book as well. And
then Frances Beale also.
Of course, Frances Beale. Sorry, I already mentioned her. So I tried to show that it was not just a white middle class movement, that it had an impact on women of all, races and sexuality and gender. Transgender does not come in much, although Polly Murray was trans. She was closeted, very closeted at the time, but wrote about it a lot and felt that she was assigned the wrong gender at birth. But I interviewed many women who were involved in the early gay rights movement. I wasn't able to be as geographically diverse as I really wanted to be, because a lot of the women who were able to get lots of attention from the media, and therefore I was able to find them and find out who they were often on the East Coast. But I also interviewed athletes. I interviewed artists. I interviewed healthcare workers, the women who started our bodies ourselves. So women from all different walks of life, the radicals who came out of the anti-war movement, versus the more older, more conservative women who were members of NOW. So it was a broad movement that millions and millions of women participated in.
Jasmine is asking, how important do you believe that racial unity is within the concept of women's liberation? What do you think are effective ways to encourage racial unity within women's liberation movement? How do you think we can encourage men and young boys to see that? That's a separate question. But there seemed to be some back and forth of that opinion amongst the storytellers in your book about kind of even the concept of double jeopardy, to be Black and female. It was like an extra layer of something that you had to get through.
Right. And double jeopardy also referred to what many Black women or women who were poor would call the double day, which was working all day and then going home and, running your family. And they, of course, would have loved to have been white bored housewives out in Westchester County, the women who Betty Friedan wrote about in The Feminine Mystique. And it's also important to remember there was already a lot of animosity between white women and Black women at this time, because white women were often considered, cruel bosses, who employed Black women to do their, domestic work for them. And so we would just come out of the civil rights movement. There was very little integration in universities, and cities were quite segregated. People didn't know each other very well across racial lines at this time, unless they were involved in the civil rights movement, which many of the feminists who I interviewed were originally involved in the civil rights movement. And in fact, one of the reasons why this second wave movement succeeded was because of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam anti-war movement. And those two movements that took over the 60s and created so much social change created a perfect storm for women, because so many women were involved in both of those movements, one or the other, or sometimes both. And eventually, by the late 60s, many of them felt discriminated against as women and left those male-dominated organizations to start their own and to start fighting for their own rights. So I think that it is intersectionality is incredibly important, and that the people who were able to really teach white women what it meant to be a freedom fighter, what it meant to fight for equality, what it meant to really be discriminated against, were the Black women who were on the front lines of the civil rights movement. And I just think you can't have one without the other. You can't have justice for women and not have justice for people of color. So it's so important to work together and to have important allyships, and especially allies with men, and especially today when there's such an enormous backlash going on against women's rights. And this is the time I really truly believe that everyone should try to get over their internal differences, because we have such a incredibly important task at hand, and everyone needs to throw in together to try to defend the rights that we're losing right now.
Yeah, I agree. So Cheryl from Bucks County Free Library is saying, I'm interested in the political activism of that time and how women went from aspiring to be the fictional June Cleaver to Gloria Steinem in less than 10 years. And I think this works with another question that we received, where like the book highlights to an extent, and Sarah saying that keeping women at home was also propagated by capitalism. Can you talk about how capitalism and commercial industries had a stake in keeping women at home?
Great question. After World War II, America was flush and very wealthy as a country, but all of the manufacturers who had been building bombs and tanks started building. They needed to keep on working and keep on juicing the economy and making money. And so they made a lot of automated household machines, like washing machines and toasters and dishwashers. And then in order to sell those machines, the madmen on Madison Avenue created a very lively and convincing ad campaign that worshiped the cult of domesticity. And every single women's magazine had beautiful pictures of lovely women enjoying doing the dishes and cleaning their homes. And so there was a movement en masse of middle-class white couples heading out of the cities to the suburbs, buying houses, building. So it was this cult of domesticity that was incredibly effective at keeping women out of the workforce and out of inside the home, and the patriarchy therefore was fully in charge. This was all a capitalist plot, you might think. And something that Betty Friedan, who went to Smith College and graduated in 1942, on her 15th college reunion, decided to conduct a poll of, many of her classmates. And many of them were these white women living in the suburbs, having huge amounts of children, not using their elite educations. And she discovered that many of them were miserable and verging on going mad. She called it the problem that had no name. And she attributed this to the backslide in women's rights after World War II, because, of course, during World War II, women were needed as men went out to fight, and they were working in factories, working in offices, running a lot of things. And suddenly everyone had to go home when the men came back from the war. And so this, it's so interesting to see how history just always does, go from one side to the other. And that was one flow. And then we, of course, had the revolution that was fighting that moment in history.
And we're seeing a bit of backslide now as well.
We sure are.
Starting to move that needle back a little bit.
Yeah. In a big way.
In a really big way. I want to get to Annabelle's question about that. Annabelle from Shrewsbury Public Library says, how have women's rights and abortion rights grown together or even backslid together? I think this is also an incredibly important question as it pertains to Black women's movement. especially because of the role of sterilization practices during that time with Puerto Rican and Black women who received abortions.
Exactly. I mean, there was the sterilization program, which was completely legal, was very active, especially in the South, but also in northern urban areas. And Fannie Lou Hamer told the most chilling story of how she got what was called a Mississippi appendectomy, where she went in and had surgery and had no idea that her uterus was taken out without her ever knowing. She tried to have children, couldn't have children, and then later discovered that this had been done to her. And this happened to thousands of women, and only women of color, women who lived in poverty. And meanwhile, women who wanted to have abortions or wanted to get birth control were not able to. So it was this bizarre, extreme, but there was one thing that these two issues had in common, which was male control over female bodies. And the patriarchy was controlling women who they didn't want to have children, and they were controlling women who they did want to have children. And just to give you a sense, birth control was not legal nationally for all married people until 1965. When the Griswold decision came down in the Supreme Court. And it wasn't legal for single women nationally until 1972. Mm-hmm. And so meanwhile, there was the sexual revolution was going on in the late 60s, and more people were having sex before marriage than ever before. But birth control was unavailable. So what ended up happening was a healthcare crisis. By the late 60s, 1 million women a year were getting illegal abortions in America. And between 1,000 and 5,000 were dying. So there were big city hospitals in Harlem and Cook County, for example, in Chicago, had special wards for women suffering from botched abortions. In Cook County, 100 women a week came through those wards. So that showed that having reproductive rights is absolutely crucially important to having any sort of equality for women. And we now have, as you all know, have lost that right in America with the Dobbs decision in 2022. And there are now almost 20 banned states where women live under what I call Jane Crow, thanks to the word that Polly Murray coined back in 1965. Mm-hmm. Women live under completely different laws, and their lives, therefore, do not have anything near the amount of freedom and security that men do in those states. And most of all, and now we've seen the statistics that have started coming out, these laws are hurting women who cannot afford to fly out of the state to get abortions. It's also increasing maternal mortality among poor women and women of color. So it's discriminating against the women who are the most vulnerable of our population.
And taking us back to Comstock.
Exactly right. Yep. Comstock, he was quite a character. And we're so afraid that his crazy law that he passed in around the turn of the century, he was the post office chief of the U.S. Post Office, and he made it illegal to send pornography or any abortifacients in the mail. And so that if the Comstock law was resurrected, which Project 2025 and a lot of the Christian nationalist politicians want to do, it will shut down mifepristone and any ability to get the abortion pill in the mail, and many other terrible, oppressive things will happen.
And some states are trying to see that come to light currently. It's happening. There's a legal case in Texas at the moment from a doctor from New York mailing mifepristone to somebody in Texas. So it's very
That's
important
right.
to talk about the history.
I know. So that's why, I mean, because we are watching our rights dissolve in front of our eyes, I just think it's so important for all of us to know how bad it was for women when we had no control over our reproductive rights. And this was only 50 years ago. And we had no control for the thousands of years before that, except for with our own quiet midwives, and women managed their pregnancies and abortions and births before the American Doctors Association took that part of our lives, medical lives, over. But anyway, to go back to that is not something that women can do, you know, and we have to fight it. And some people I've talked to who live in New York think, well, it's not my problem really, or you know, they can always leave the state. You know, it's up to the states. People say, well, it's up to the states. Well, most of those states make laws that are passed by the state legislatures that are majority white male. Right. So women are not able to actually have any political power over their lives in many of these banned states.
Mm-hmm. Well, so speaking of women not having control of their own bodies and or being treated like pieces of meat, I think that Elizabeth's question kind of leads us to the 1968 Miss America protest.
Oh,
so
great.
Elizabeth from Brewster Ladies Library says, why was the burning of the bras associated with the women's movement, and who started that?
Oh my God, I'm so glad you asked that. That's actually one of the funny moments in this book. So this protest against the Miss America pageant in September of 1968 in New Jersey, in Atlantic City on the boardwalk, was organized. It was the first big public protest by the second wave feminist movement. And it was organized by a group of women who were younger, more radical. They called themselves Women's Liberation. And they had a really good sense of humor. They understood that getting press attention was very important to spreading the word and increasing their numbers. And one of the women who organized this is an amazing, one of my favorites in the book and favorites in the world, Robin Morgan, who was a child actor and an amazing writer and poet. And as she worked in the civil rights movement in the South and also in the anti-war movement. And she was also a yippie, which were hippies that were political. And Abby Hoffman, you may have heard of, was one of her, fellow yippies. And they loved theater and creating theater in order to prove their point, and also to get press attention. So women turned up, a few hundred of them, onto the boardwalk, and they had signs saying, "I am not a piece of meat," and much more clever things than that. They had a lamb that they walked around with them, lamb going to slaughter, just like all the women on the stage inside the auditorium. They crept inside, snuck inside the auditorium, and unfurled a massive banner on the balcony that said Women's Liberation. And so they were funny and they were disruptive. And it was a turning point for the movement, because as Robin Morgan told me when I interviewed her in her apartment in the West Village, her Women's Liberation group, she was member of a group in New York called the Radical Feminists. They had 50 people come to their meeting the week before the pageant protest, and 150 the week after. And I also interviewed a lot of women who read about this, and they lived in different cities and different places. And it was their first time of knowing, they might have missed the founding of NOW, which didn't make an enormous splash. And so this was their first time of understanding the movement. So, but back to the bras burning. One of their stunts was they had a Friedan trash can. So it was a big trash can. It said Freedom trash can on it, and in which they threw their bras and girdles. And something to remember. I always thought, why would they do that? I love my bra. Thank God for my bra. No, bras back then were incredibly uncomfortable. They were padded and pointed and huge and itchy and made you look like a Cupid doll. And so they really were, it was an instrument of oppression. And many women wore girdles, which were really, really painful. So they were happy to shed those, put them in the Freedom trash can. Well, Robin Morgan had given an interview to a New York Post reporter the week before, previewing what they were going to do on the boardwalk. And she said, we are going to have a Freedom trash can and we're going to burn our bras and our girdles. And but it turned out they couldn't get a fire permit because the boardwalk was wood, was made out of wood. You couldn't have fires on the boardwalk. So in the end, they never burned their bras. But the article ran, and this idea of burning bras, and that the idea came from, by the way, burning draft cards, which is what so many young men were doing in America in 1968, which was at the height of the Vietnam War. And thousands and thousands of young men were being drafted, were dying in Vietnam. And so one of the acts of defiance, which people did in public at anti-war protests, was to burn the draft cards. So that's where they got the idea of burning their bras. But at least in Atlantic City, a bra was not burned. I hope that's not too disappointing.
No. It's there in sentiment. So I really want to talk about Shirley Chisholm. And this is also kind of when we start in part 2 of the book, when we start to hear a lot of this very immersive kind of trip into Shirley Chisholm's campaign and then time at the Capitol. This is also when we start to hear about men. So what is that significance there? Or we start to hear from men, I'm sorry, in the book. We start to hear from men during the same time.
Well, there are two kinds of men we hear from with Shirley Chisholm, the men who were for her and the men who were not. And let's start with the men who were not.
Okay.
Shirley Chisholm was a school teacher in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, right here in my borough. And she was very involved in local democratic politics and did all the things that women did in politics then in the early 60s. She, raised money and she licked envelopes and she worked in the office. And then a state Senate seat came up. And she decided to run for it, even though all of the men who she worked with were very much against that. They wanted the seat. She ran, she got it, and she went to the New York State Assembly, which was a big deal. Then in 1968, a few years later, the first Black majority district was drawn in Brooklyn. So before that, Brooklyn was only represented by white members of Congress because all the districts were majority white. This was on purpose drawn so that there was a good chance that a Black politician could win. And so she threw her hat into that ring, which was also not appreciated by the Black men who wanted that position. So she ran, she went door to door, got women all over her district to vote for her. And she spoke fluent Spanish. It was a very racially diverse district, and convinced the women to come out and vote for her, which they did. She won in 1968 against all odds and became the first Black woman ever elected to the U.S. Congress. And when she was sworn in 1969 in January, her first 2 years in office, which I wrote about, I have to say it was actually the hardest chapter that I wrote. Because the sexism, the racism, really, racism and sexism combined. And she often wrote about and talked about what it was like to have to battle both racism and sexism. And she often said that she thought sexism was harder to overcome. But regardless of what was Harvard, it was both horrible. And she, at that time, so many members of Congress, especially Democrats, were Southern white men. And they were outrageously rude to her. On one of her first days there, she went to the cafeteria, the members only cafeteria, for lunch, took her tray to an empty table, and a congressman came up to her and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but this is the Georgia delegation table." And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know where the New York delegation was. Won't you please join me?" And he said, no, this is the Georgia delegation table. So he would not sit with her, nor would anyone else in the Georgia delegation. So she had lunch alone that day. There was another man who was infuriated by the fact that she earned as much money as he did. And they made $42,500 a year. Every time he passed her in the hallway, he would say 42.5 in a cruel way. So she had to deal with this just outrageous sexism and racism. And she just faced it down with humor. She was incredible. And she called her staff. She made sure she called it, "We are the United Nations." They were women, mostly women of all colors. And she called them the Chisettes. And she then shocked everybody, including the Chisettes, who I talked to, by deciding to run for president in 1972. She kind of shocked most of her staff. Wow. And certainly didn't check it with the Black Congressional Caucus or the National Women's Political Caucus. So she felt she knew that she was a symbolic candidate. She knew that she didn't have a chance of winning, but she had a really interesting conviction why it was important for her to run, because she wanted to inspire young people of color, people who had felt disenfranchised by mainstream politics, to get involved, because she believed that the way to make change was through mainstream political activism. By getting elected, by working for people to get the right people elected, and by working within the existing system. So that's what she believed in. And she thought that she could be a catalyst for change. And at the time, in 1972, Vietnam War was still raging. The youth of America was not voting. They were furious. They were taking to the streets all over the country because they didn't want to be in this war, and distrusted the government on both Democrats and Republicans. It didn't matter. And but they were allowed to vote for the first time. Nixon had changed the law at age 18. It used to be 21. So that was the first election that 18-year-olds could vote for president. And so she had huge crowds everywhere she went. And she inspired people like Barbara Lee, who was a student at Mills College, and she came to speak at Mills. Barbara Lee thought she was so incredible, had never registered to vote. She was a member of the Black Panthers. She didn't think she had anything in common with anyone who was in elected government. And in fact, she didn't. But Shirley Chisholm convinced her to register to vote and to run her campaign in Oakland, which Barbara Lee did. And a few years later, Barbara Lee became the congresswoman from that district herself, and where she served for many terms. So she's an example of what Shirley Chisholm did for this country.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So you mentioned Shirley wanting to kind of make change from within, and it makes me think about Billie Jean King and some athletes that you talk to, or whose stories are highlighted in the book. Unfortunately, women in sports are still not anywhere near equal pay. But so Billie Jean King and other female tennis players literally had to start their own circuit to start getting paid. They weren't getting paid at all, but men were.
Yeah, they were paid about a tenth of what men were paid. And they were in the same tournaments, the same circuits with them. And it just became so insulting. And Billie Jean King was such an incredibly fantastic player, and drew crowds. And she knew that she had the power to to help women get paid more. And also they couldn't really afford to even be on the circuit because they couldn't get paid. Their lives were very difficult. And so she rallied a group of really brave tennis players to break from the U.S. Tennis Association and start their own group and their own amazing. They were called the Original Nine. There were 9 of them, and they started the Virginia Slims tournament. And they toured all over the country, playing on a shoestring, but rallying huge crowds. And she basically broke through this very important wall, which was that women couldn't get crowds, weren't really authentic athletes, and couldn't really be professional athletes. Only men could be professional athletes. And Billie Jean King was actually, I think, one of the most important feminists of this era. And she wasn't always taken seriously by feminists. She wasn't part of the movement necessarily. But what she did was encourage so many women to become empowered. And sports turns out to be so important. I talk about the woman Bernice Sandler who helped make Title IX law with Edith Green, a congresswoman from Oregon, and back in the late 60s and early 70s, women didn't have athletic scholarships. In 1972, when Title IX was passed, 50,000 male students had athletic college scholarships. 50 women did. There were very few teams for women. So it just meant access to education what was very difficult, and that men had this massive advantage. So, I also interviewed Bobby Gibb, who was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon illegally in 1966. And her story was just,
great story.
Made me cry. And whenever I tell it, I get weepy. But she ran, in nurse shoes. She jumped out of a bush. Doctors told women that if they ran long distances, their uterus would fall out. So you could only women athletes could only race up to 1.5 miles. And she finished the race and realized halfway through that she wasn't just doing this for her, that she was doing it for 50% of the population, to show that women could be strong and empowered. And women were finally allowed to run legally in the Boston Marathon in 1972, and couldn't run the marathon in the Olympics until 1984. But this year in the Olympics, we had more women than male athletes. So we've come a really long way when it comes to sports.
The Boston Marathon is an example of how men did a good thing in the women's liberation movement. They didn't tell on her for running.
Yes, no, exactly. And so they protected her, and they loved that she was running with them. And Catherine Switzer, who ran that same race the next year, 1967, and she registered under K. Switzer, so she had a penny and a number. So she was actually timed. Bobby Gibb was not. They tried to pull her off, the official who ran the marathon, but her friends who were running with her protected her so that she could finish.
Cindy from Estes Valley Library is saying, as a woman coming of age during the period your book covers, I feel fortunate to have been a part of it. First woman in my big law firm.
Wow.
I worry that today's young women don't understand what the women's movement was about. What do you think?
I think you're right. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. And I think, and because we are backsliding, it's more important than ever for young women, Gen Z women, to understand that it can't, their lives, they now have fewer rights, than I had when I was their age. And this is the first time in, 60 years that has been the case. So raising their consciousness to understand that misogyny was, and patriarchy ruled our lives until the 1970s and will rule it again if we don't do something to stop it. So I think it's important to honor your generation, to honor the generation that made so many sacrifices for the women who came afterwards. And I'm an example of someone who didn't totally appreciate it. I worked at Newsweek after college, a few years after college, and in the late 80s. And there I had two bosses, Lucy Howard and Lynn Povich, who I would send articles to, and they were my editors. I worked in Washington, they were in New York. And lo and behold, many years later, I interviewed both Lynn Povich and Lucy Howard because they were part of the first class action for sex discrimination in 1970. And they had Eleanor Holmes Norton as their lawyer, who was at the ACLU, and 46 of them sued Newsweek because they couldn't get jobs that were better than being researchers and mail girls. All the men had the writing and editing jobs. And so they sued and they succeeded and changed the law, the workforce for the rest of us. And when I went to work at Newsweek in the 80s, I had no idea. So it's just, we must know our history in order to move forward. It's so important.
Mm-hmm. Willow from Cumberland Public Library is saying, what surprised you the most while researching?
Oh, Willow. That's I have to say, and I've already made this point, that what surprised me the most is how powerfully important women of color were to this movement and how much we owe them for their bravery. And each one of them, and so many of them had died, unfortunately. I couldn't interview Florence Kennedy. I couldn't interview Margaret Sloan, obviously Shirley Chisholm. Or Fannie Lou Hamer, I was able to interview Eleanor Holmes Norton and Barbara Smith and many others, Frances Beale. But to understand how I didn't understand, and I felt like history had not helped me, the history books had not helped me fully understand how foundational these women were to this movement. So that was one of the important surprises. I would also say that I was surprised by how broad it was when I started interviewing artists like Faith Ringgold and Judy Chicago, and learned that women were not shown in museums. They were not sold in galleries. Those two artists, their paintings were worth nothing in the 70s and 80s, and now they sell for millions of dollars. To interview the women who started Our Bodies Ourselves, I was so surprised to understand that women didn't understand how their bodies worked. They didn't understand the basics. So just
hard to swallow.
It's just hard to really, I had surprises every day, really.
So any future projects? Doll from LA County says, will you be writing a book that brings the movement further up to date?
Well, I think so. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know that the thing I need to write about next and really explore is the reproductive rights challenges in the banned states. So I am going to focus my attention there and make sure to gather all the stories so that we really know what's happening.
Yeah. Great. I can't wait to read that. All right. The question that I love to close with each author is, what are you reading right now that you think everyone should run out to the library and check out immediately?
Oh my gosh. That's hard too. It's like, picking your favorite child. But I have to say the book I couldn't put down most recently is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. It won the Booker Prize, I think a year ago for 2023. And he's an Irish writer, and it is, I think, a genius novel. But it is also very prescient, and it is about what happens to a family when a authoritarian government takes over their country and how they cope with it. So I think it's very relevant to today.
Certainly sounds like you might be reading a scary story.
It's a little scary, but it's not really dark. It's still really fascinating and kind of fun. You know, it's not a depressing read.
Okay, good. And that was Paul Lynch?
Paul Lynch, Prophet Song.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's
Thank
truly
you,
an hour has gone by. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, I loved it. Thank you to everyone for coming and tuning in.
I want to echo that sentiment. Without all of you, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, if you scroll below the live stream video, you can see the resources area, which contains a link to Clara's book. We look forward to everyone joining us next week on March 26th when we talk with Jennifer Weiner about her newest book, The Griffin Sisters' Greatest Hits. Be sure to register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I'm Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us.